Good evening, y'all. My name is Kenzie New Walker, and I work as the director of the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum, a grassroots institution that educates and preserves a people's history of the Coal Wars. We're located in historic Maitland in Mingo County, and we've been around for 9 years now. The museum's work entails a diverse public programming, including this Mine Wars Forum program. Our small team works daily to educate and preserve the stories of coal miners and their families' efforts to unionize the southern coal fields of West Virginia. We preserve and curate artifacts and exhibits, both digitally and in person. We provide lesson plans and a growing list of resources for teachers to get this history into their classrooms. And most recently, we have been building monuments in southern West Virginia with our Courage in the Hollers project. This evening, you are tuning into the third episode of Mine Wars Forum Season 4. This year's Mine Wars Forum has been made possible in part by the West Virginia Humanities Council. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of the Council. I'm so excited to welcome tonight's guest, Dr. Janet Wells Greene. She's a labor historian and an educator who was born in McDowell County, West Virginia. In recognition of her lifelong efforts to bring labor history to the general public, she was awarded the prestigious John Commerford Award by the New York Labor History Association in 2010. Her research includes oral history projects with miners and their wives, industrial workers in New York City, and archival documentation of working people and their unions from the 18th to 20th century. Her research interests include the history of labor, technology, and public relations in industry. Her career in non-traditional education for adults began in 1978 at the Highlander Center in Tennessee as co-director of development, where she worked with and learned from Miles Horton. She served as a founding faculty member of the Southern Appalachian Labor School at the West Virginia Institute of Technology, director of the Harry Van Arsdale Labor Documentation Project of the Wagner Labor Archives, historian and director of the Library of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York, and assistant professor of labor studies at the Van Arsdale Center for Labor Studies at Empire State College of the State University of New York. Janet retired to Newark, Ohio with her husband David Greene in 2009, and together they co-founded the Freedom School in Logan County, an all-volunteer adult education program designed to help people learn their own history and read the world around them. Over a period of 10 years, she developed a film series, library and industrial history tours for the community, and she currently lives in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Welcome to the forum, Janet. I'm so glad you're with us tonight.
Thank you. It's a thrill to be here.
So you have amassed a really impressive amount of scholarship throughout your career, and we're going to get through all the projects you've been involved in. But first, I'd like for you to take us back and tell us a little bit about your childhood, some of which you spent in McDowell County.
Oh, yeah. I was born in Hemphill, just outside of Welch. And, well, I was born in the hospital, Welch, but Hemphill is where we lived. My dad was from Wise County, Virginia, and he worked in the store when he was just out of high school. He went to work in the store I can't remember the name of the coal company right this second, but in McDowell County, and they saved his job for him when he went to World War II. So while he was gone to World War II, he met my mother when he was in Florida, where she was working as a secretary. So they got married and came back to McDowell County, and he was working in the store again. So my mother was a war bride, and they had quite a time, the Florida lady in the coal camp. So that's where I was born. And my dad, he was a pretty cool person, and it was hard to be on the company side for me, because I was just a little kid, but he was definitely a company man. And
Mhm.
when we were about 7 years old, we were living in the top of Hemp Hill where all the mine bosses lived. And they decided they were going to tear down our house. And I thought to myself, wow, how can this be? You know, they're going to tear down our house, and they tore it down and they made a parking lot for the mine officials and they moved us off the hill. So I thought that's not so good. You know, if the why would the company tear down your house if you're supposed to be on their side? So it was just really interesting. And I always wondered what happened, you know, because things got very different quickly. I was born in 46, and suddenly we were moving. We moved to Mercer County, and my dad was gone a lot, and his job was closing the company stores. So the um, the boom of the war years, and I'll talk about the what happened during the war years a little bit later if you want to. But the boom of the war years meant um, that one of the things the company did to try to there was a big transformation in the coal industry. So the companies decided to sell off their towns basically, and in order to do that, they wanted to close the stores. That's the first thing you have to do. So we moved around to places where people weren't working anymore. They were injured, disabled, and this was right after the Health and Welfare Fund went in. So it was a very deep time of transition, and I didn't understand it. And then we moved away in '56, like 500,000 other people did in the coal fields at that time after the mechanization agreement. So my whole childhood, I would just wondered what happened. You know, what was that all about? So it took a long time to understand it. And when I finally started reading some of the history, I got even more interested. So I think that um, the divisions in the workforce, you know, the people who worked for the companies who were living at the whim of the companies in the same way that the miners were. You know, we had no more job security than the miners, and in a way, we had less because in '47, when Taft-Hartley got passed, um, people who worked in supervisory positions, including the store manager, couldn't be in a union anymore. Before that, there was a big move to have store managers be in a union, and that was part of the labor legislation that was passed after World War II that um, to keep the union movement from spreading. Let's just classify people as supervisors and then say you can't be in the union. So we didn't get the health and welfare fund that the miners got. And my mother had surgery right after we moved. So that took all of the money they had. It was it was hard. And then we were in Tennessee. So nobody else was from the mining community. So it was a very sort of isolating experience. We didn't go to Detroit um, or Cleveland or Baltimore like a lot of other people did. We went to live near our relatives in Nashville. So it took me a long time to find somebody else who was from the coal fields. I didn't really find anybody else until I was in my 20s.
Yeah. What was that experience like leaving? I mean, I think we've always seen this trend
Mhm.
of people, leaving the coal fields. Did you feel it sounds like you felt othered, growing up in McDowell County. You weren't the daughter of a coal miner, so to speak. Did you have those same feelings leaving West Virginia, leaving McDowell?
It was my home. I missed it so much. I love West Virginia, and I did have friends. You know, it wasn't like we didn't have any friends, but I think that our family was a little bit. You know, people wouldn't get as friendly with us as they probably would have if my dad hadn't worked in the store. There were people who would say, "She's a coal miner's daughter, coal miner." My store manager's daughter. I could hear them whispering behind my back. So that meant don't say certain things to her. And I found actually when I was a little kid, we were living in Mercer County, it was sort of in between Matoka and Princeton, if you know where that is, and in a coal camp called Springton. And I had some really good friends there. They were just, I really liked the other kids. We had a great time because it was small. But I remember we started a little club, and I said, I'll be the president. And my best friend, Doris, she said, well, I'll take the minutes. And I said, what are minutes? And so she told me what they were. And then I realized that there was a whole world that I didn't know anything about. Because her father was probably a union officer or member, but she didn't tell me that. She just said, you have to write down what happens at the meeting. And there's no way that, that we had anything to do with minutes. So it was just, it was an interesting division. But on the other hand, I went to the school that had outdoor toilets and a pump in the front yard, and the train went through the middle of the playground during recess, and we had to get the cinders taken out of our eyes. Afterwards, you play for a while, and then you go inside and spend 10 minutes with a teacher and get all the cinders out of your eyes. Yeah.
So how did growing up in this way as like the store manager's daughter, how did that, impact your worldview?
Well, I thought it was pretty special. I think it's an interesting, I think I had privileges that I didn't realize I had until we left, and then I didn't have them anymore. But we lived in the camps, these privileges are this much different, right? We had a bathroom in our house, but we still had a coal stove in the house. We still had, the company would come and dump the coal at the bottom of the steps down the hill, and you'd have to go down there with a scuttle and go get it and bring it back up again. We lived right with everybody else who worked in the mines. And I don't feel, that during the time that we lived in the camps, which was, I was born in 46 and we left in 56, I didn't feel animosity from anybody. I just felt a little bit separate.
Mm-hmm. So I talked, in my introduction about several public history projects that you've been involved in. This has been a big, big piece of your career. And we're definitely going to get to hear about a few of them, but I wondered if you could talk first about some of the challenges when it comes to public history. I know I've got a few of my own, but I'd love to hear from you, who I consider as like an expert in this field.
Well, I think you were just talking about some of those challenges is the class differences of this class stratification, where you're perceived as somebody coming in from the outside to talk to people. And whether you're from a different state or whether you're from a different race or whether you're from a different nationality, there are, people are reluctant to talk. But on the other hand, if we're talking about, public history as the product or public history as the process,
Mm-hmm.
Public history as the process really involves trying to figure out if you're interested in being the person who shares the stories of a community, then you have to figure out what stories people want to share and how best to do that. And I just want to back up a little tiny bit and talk about how I got into this, because it was an accident. When I was working at the Southern Appalachian Labor School, and I came back to West Virginia, finally got back to West Virginia after all this time, in 1979. So it was from 56 to 79. And I knew everywhere I went, I was like an Appalachian. And that's all they could talk about was, oh yeah, you're an Appalachian. And they'd look to see if I had on shoes. And I was living in lots of different states. I was living in California and Illinois and Tennessee. So I was about 30 by the time I came back to West Virginia. And one of the things that I heard somebody give a talk when I was at Highlander who said, this Appalachians are not, that is a category that doesn't describe material conditions. This is an industrial workforce in a rural setting. And so you can't just lump everybody under one category. If you're going to talk about what it is that makes people poor, you have to look at the industry itself and see how people are exploited. And I knew that, but I hadn't heard anybody say it quite so clearly. It was really an important revelation. So in that sense, we're all workers at some level. So it made me think, and I'd been exploited a lot as a worker by the time I was 33, just because jobs in the humanities don't pay very much. And there was a big shift in technology, just like the shift in the coal industry, where everybody got laid off after 1950 when they brought in the machines. The same thing happened. I was a librarian. The same thing happened in libraries. All of a sudden, I was trained to be a person who answers your questions, but now there's Google, so you don't really need that. So there's a whole lot of things that happened that shifted the employment prospects for people who had spent years training for jobs that suddenly disappeared. So I didn't feel that separate anymore. So I think that's one thing that makes it easier for me to do public history with working people, because we are all working people. Mm-hmm. And so that's a challenge. The other challenge is the way that there are power relationships in institutions that present the past. So if you're trying to tell a story from one side or the other, then somebody's going to make you not want to tell it. And I think we've seen so much of that nationally in the last few years. But it's always been like that. It's always like when I was teaching for the Southern Appalachian Labor School from 1979 to 86, I guess, the people in the UMW would always say, oh yeah, only thing they ever taught us about unions when we were in school was Union Carbide. So, and I think that that's really true, that there are lots of barriers to people understanding their own history. So the necessity of public history is great, but the obstacles are also great. So when you get into it, you gotta run into that.
Wait, I know exactly what you're talking about. Janet, did you always know that you were Appalachian? That's interesting to me.
No, not until I left West Virginia.
Yeah. It's, because I didn't grow up, thinking of myself as Appalachian until college.
Well, that's a label that was created as part of the Appalachian Regional Commission, which is a federal governmental agency to deal with all this sudden exodus of people who were trying to find work. And it was, lots of states from Maine to Georgia along the Appalachian Mountain region. And it is if you look at it as a governmental entity, that's one thing. I'm not an Appalachian studies person, but I've read a lot of the books, and we know how the idea of Appalachia was really created to help some institutions grow, as well as much earlier than that. And also, the Appalachian Regional Commission was part of the sort of way to give money to certain depressed areas to keep people from being so angry that they were losing their jobs. So that's it's a term that I think is problematical or it has been in the past anyway. And because it really erases the presence of working people and their exploitation from the discussion.
Mhm. I want to talk more about public history. Did you teach public history?
No, I did public history.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
Well, I had some great public history teachers. When I went to NYU to work after, I forget what year that was, in the 90s, I was just working in the archives, and I had a desk next to Rachel Bernstein, who was a professor in the public history department, who was doing some archival work with right by my side, right there in the in the library at the Wagner Labor Archives at NYU. And so we got to talking, and she said, "You should probably take a class." So I did. And I didn't really want to, because I felt like public history was pretty hard and maybe I should do it anymore. But what I learned was from her how it is a contentious field. It always has been. When you think every time there's a monument or a museum or a historical marker, people have had shootouts in the parking lot over whether there should be a historical marker there honoring a coal mining strike in Windber, Pennsylvania, according to my friend Millie Bike, who's the author of that book on the history of the miners of Windber. So, yeah, I mean, some people don't want the history told, and some people do. So you just have to fight about it. But it would be nice if it were just much easier.
Yeah. Well, at the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum, air interpretive focus is really between the early 1900s and up to the 1930s with FDR's administration.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's been several other very important mine wars in different regions, different time periods. And I want to talk about one of them, which is the Great Coal Strike of 1946. You know what this was?
I'm so glad you mentioned that one. I was born during the middle of that strike. And I think that so many things, that's a really pivotal strike. And for one reason, because I did some research on this, it involved miners in 23 states. 23 states in America. And it was a national coal strike. And it was the strike that established the Health and Welfare Fund for the United Mine Workers. So if you look in the Encyclopedia of West Virginia, for example, or most other things, they talk about, oh yeah, the miners struck and they wanted a health and welfare fund, and the federal government took over the mines, and they sat down with the miners and said, okay, you can have it. And then that was it. But really, it was a much longer process than that. The mines were actually seized by an agency called the Solid Fuels Administration for War, which was part of the Coal Mines Administration of the Navy. And because the strike was right after World War II ended, and there was the transition from wartime production to peacetime production was absolutely dependent on the presence of coal as an energy source. So John Lewis was very strategic in planning this strike for just about then. And so many people hated John L. Lewis because he had been striking during wartime, when all the unions in the country had signed a no strike pledge because of the war effort. And Lewis didn't follow up with that because people were getting killed in the mines. Many, many people were getting killed and injured in the mines because production was not stopping. It was going so fast. And it's just an example of how, war production is important, but you shouldn't have more deaths in the industrial workforce than you do on the battlefield. And it was just about neck and neck. So we have the mine workers had struck during 2 or 3 times during World War II. And then at the end, because this was a good time as the peacetime tradition was happening, a good time to ask for the Health and Welfare Fund because there were so many injured people, serious injuries, huge back injuries, all kinds of stuff that mining injuries are not trivial, as you all know. So, so the government seized the mines and agreed to negotiate this contract that would say, yes, there will be a health and welfare fund. It will be paid for by a royalty on the tonnage of the participating coal companies, which was almost every coal company in the country. But it wasn't exactly settled in a year because first they had to have an investigation, which lasted almost more than a year. And they produced this report, which probably many of you know all about, even though you don't know you know about it. This is the medical survey of the bituminous coal industry. See the people on the front? And it was a photographic, they sent photographers and Navy investigators all over the country to talk to people about their living conditions and their health and to investigate the medical conditions in the mines, not in the mines, in the mining communities. And it was a very interesting and thorough survey. They visited 247 mines or something like that and took photographs. The photographs are the ones that you see all the time. And I had a photograph here today of Welch, but I don't think it came through when I tried to send it to you all. But the narrative that the government ended up, because they were just horrified by what they found. The conditions were, as we all know, in camps pretty bad. They're worse in West Virginia and Eastern Kentucky than some other places. But the narrative that they wrote said, "Oh, there are good companies and bad companies," and it made it sound very even-handed. But in fact, the good companies had bad camps, and the bad companies had worse camps. So there were lots of things that happened to this. It was very embarrassing for the coal industry and for America. We just, defeated Hitler, and we were like, America is so great. And then here comes the study that says, oh my God. So the companies are very eager to get rid of the camps. They're every time they've been investigated in the past, and they've been investigated many, many, many times after a strike, they would send one of these commissions in for the whole century. And they always had the same excuse. Oh, well, these houses are not meant to last, and we aren't going to be using them that much more anyway. And they said that for a lot of years. But this time they really meant it. So that's how my father, who was working at the store, who thought he was suddenly named regional sales manager. Oh, he was going to be regional sales manager for the Pocahontas Fuel Company, which had suddenly become Samet Solvay, a division of Allied Chemical and Dye Corporation. And then his job was closing all the stores, which is like the HR trick where you say, oh, you're getting promoted, but you have to fire everybody. And so his job was closing all the stores, and then he wouldn't have a job either. So that's one reason why I was so interested in this strike, because this was step one. Step two for the company's strategy was, Lewis was really expecting the coal companies to pay what they promised and to actually fund this health and welfare fund so that it could continue, so it could give medical, and it did, cradle to grave medical care for everybody for a long time. But the money started running out really quickly. So in 1950, he negotiated the mine mechanization agreement, which I'm sure you all know about, that brought in these machines that reduced the workforce by 50% ultimately. And that was my childhood, watching these places just turn into ghost towns as we moved into them. So that's why it's a significant strike because it looked like a victory. Blair Mountain looks like a defeat, but it was really a victory because people gained the solidarity that they needed from having gone through that to then jump right in when they got a chance to join a union in the 30s after the NRA passed. But the victory of the 1946 strike was the beginning of a long war against the workers that put coal production first, in which companies reneged on their promises. They got out of it, and then then there were a lot of catch-up measures that some of the states did to try to continue to fund this stuff. But the UMWA tried to build hospitals. There were 10 hospitals, and they ended up getting closed after they were sold to the Presbyterian Church, bought them to try to bail them out. So here we are. We need healthcare still today. We need jobs still today. We have had a great victory, which looks like it was probably a defeat. And I think if we understood this period now where one union says, we're going to go it alone, we're going to have health and welfare and medical care for our members, and we don't need anybody else, because Lewis was famous for being in and out of the AFL-CIO or the CIO. And so he was all alone when he negotiated that contract. And so the lessons that we can learn from that strike was that a victory may look like a victory, but if it's not got the right foundation under it, it's not going to be a victory. So that's why I think it's really important.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to explain that and put it into context and, the implications of that strike. We're still feeling it today.
You bet.
I wanted to talk a little bit about women. And
let's talk about women.
I think it's really interesting because I think sometimes in conversations around the mine wars, Mother Jones is like this looming figure. And she often, when we talk about women in the mine wars, she often gets pointed to. But as you and I both know, there are a lot of incredible women who don't get that same center stage. Could you talk about what the women's roles were in the coal camps and during strike actions, and what other women should we know about besides Mother Jones?
Well, I think that one of the great strategies that the companies developed when they were building the camps, because, remember, there was nothing here. There was a lot here, but there wasn't any industry here. So when they came in, you've probably seen the pictures, it was just literally camps. People were living in tents, chopping down trees and trying to figure out how to make a mine. But there was a certain strategy after a while, because in a lot of the mining towns out west, there weren't so many women. And some of the more paternalistic companies realized that in order to control the workforce, it would be good to have families. And so they managed to build houses and start recruiting miners that had families. And so the women would then be there to cook for their families, for the miner, and to do all the washing and to do all the maintenance that's necessary for a person to go and work all day for many, 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 many hours. And so having women in the coal camps was unpaid labor, but it was in some ways quite familiar to women because in the 19th century and earlier, the household economy depended on the unpaid labor of women and to do all the domestic work in homes where there weren't servants. So, but you had to have certain skills. And that's what was so interesting about when my mother came from Florida to live in a coal camp. My father was horrified to come home and find there was no dinner. She was crying in the kitchen because the fire went out and she couldn't cook. She didn't know how to cook anyway, but she didn't tell him that. But she didn't know how to build a fire, and she didn't know how to cook on a coal stove. And so he had to buy an electric stove, and it was interesting. He was from a family that was all boys, so they all had to learn how to do the traditional women's things. He could make butter and milk a cow and feed the chickens, and they didn't have a cow or chickens either. My mother didn't know anything about that, but there was these skills, that people had because they were rural women living in a situation where they were used to providing food using some kind of fuel. So the Italians and the Polish people and people from Russia had been used to cooking in these big outdoor ovens, and you may have seen them, some of the remnants of those around in the coal fields where they built the ovens in the camps for people to cook their bread. And then people who had lived near coal were burning coal in their houses and were cooking on coal even before they moved into the camps. So they knew how to do it. It was people have been cooking on coal since the 1600s, but it's a skill, and also it's you can't really leave it. Keep the home fires burning, right?
Yeah.
So those are, it's important to think about, and the women that I interviewed, lots of them talked about how they had to be ready to send in a second lunch if the people were going to work later. So sometimes they worked a lot later and they'd have to send in another meal. People would take a meal. And then men who didn't have wives, either they lived in a boarding house or they hired somebody else's wife to wash their clothes, make their lunches. All the things that you wouldn't really think about today. You could drive through Wendy's, but there weren't too many. The coal camps didn't have a lot of restaurants. Let's say that. I think they had no restaurants, pretty much.
What other women should folks know about?
Well, a lot of the women that I think are really important are people who were in the welfare rights organizing later. After the mines really shut down, miners were still here and their wives were still here, and so they really organized. I interviewed Ethel Brewster about her work with the Welfare Rights Organization, which was in the 60s, after they gave out the first food stamps in West Virginia. People were getting welfare and they weren't really, you had to fight to get it, and she and Shelva Thompson and some other people were involved in getting school lunches for the kids because people didn't really have enough money to buy food to make lunches, because every time the checks would come out, the grocers would raise up the prices. So it was really hard for people to feed their kids. So a bunch of people from West Virginia and other parts of the coal fields went to Washington and testified to get school lunches. Now I think people laugh at school lunches because, Reagan said ketchup was a vegetable. But it's really important to think about. There wasn't a lot of birth control in the coal fields either. So if you have 12 kids, you need a lot of food. And it's hard to come up with that when you don't have too much money. So those are some of the women. And in terms of strikes, people helped each other during the strikes. I think you all have probably a lot of documentation about that.
Yeah.
How the other thing that, rather than even a lot of people would get fired after a strike, and so their wives would be the ones who have to move and take the house and go to the next house. So it was a big job to just make a home wherever you have to be, if it was a tent or if you were moving a lot or whatever. And for African American women, the segregation racially in the camps involved the segregation of amenities. So the camps for Black people didn't have running water, and they often didn't have pumps that were very close to the house, and they were often not working. everybody had these problems, but the water supply and the sanitation cleaning of the privies, the outdoor privies, could only be done by the company, and if they really wanted to punish you, they wouldn't do it. So it was another way that of controlling the workforce by sort of dealing with these necessary sanitary things.
I want to turn our attention to Logan County.
Oh, good.
You spent some
time. Drink of water.
Yeah, sure. You spent some time working in Logan County, and I believe with all my heart, the museum really stands on the shoulders of those who came before us, people who shepherded critical oral history projects and who led preservation efforts at a time when there was still a lot of resistance and secrecy. Not to say that those things don't exist today, because they do. But you have very direct and personal experience in this. And for folks that don't know, there was an effort to establish a Logan County Coal Miners Museum in the 1980s. Janet, could you talk about that?
Absolutely. It was incorporated. It was, I have my little framed membership in the other room. I forgot to bring it in here, but it was an outgrowth of the Southern Appalachian Labor School, because we taught classes in District 17 and District 29. And Logan was the headquarters in Logan. Logan was the headquarters for Sub-District 3 of District 17. And one of the officers in that headquarters was a man named Emil Canterbury, who was just a lovely person, and he was involved with a lot of the classes that we did with the Mine Workers Union. We did steward training and things like that. We did a lot of sort of education to the union asked the labor school to put on education programs for them. And and I was telling somebody this morning, when you teach miners, you don't get to do a lot of talking. They're going to tell you a lot. And I learned a lot of things, especially in Logan, where they talked about, the union organizers got burned up in the power plant. And so this was, pretty interesting. So we were in great competition to just have a class, I had to find some good stories too. So we had Barbara Koppel had given the labor school a print of Harlan County, USA, and nobody had ever seen it because they didn't show it. And so we would show half of it at the first part of the day, and we'd show the other half at the end. So they would always stay around to see the end. Anyway, so as a consequence of getting to know these folks, Emil and I were talking one day, and he said, I really wish we had a coal miners museum here. I would love to have the story of the children who worked in the mines. And I thought, well, we could do that. No, because the Humanities Foundation has grants. And so I thought, well, that'd be cool. So we talked about it. And so I wrote a grant, and I moved to Logan, and my husband came too. And we started in. So Linda Ann Ewan from West Virginia Tech had been doing classes with the teachers union in Logan County for a couple of years. She had a grant from the National Science Foundation. So she'd been teaching labor history to teachers in Logan County. And I went with her to probably a semester's worth of classes when I first moved to West Virginia, because I thought, that's a good way to learn things. She was a good teacher. And so I had met some of the teachers in those classes. So when we came to Logan, the grant, we incorporated, I can't remember exactly what the sequence of events were, but we got the grant and we ran it through West Virginia Tech. You have to have somebody to administer your grant. So West Virginia Tech administered it. And then the object was really should have been a planning grant, but I don't think we knew there were planning grants. Didn't know anything about this. I was about 30, 33 years old. And we said, well, okay, the best thing to do, I read some books. I read this Association for State and Local History. They have books about how to tell the story of your community. They don't tell you what's going to happen, but they tell you how to do it. And one of the things you need to do if you're going to have an institution is you need to have a board, and you need to have people who are well connected in the community who can help you find the people who are going to be telling you the story that you can record through oral histories and gather artifacts if you're going to do that. And then you have to have a place, and you have to have a place to keep whatever anybody wants to display, and you have to have a way to keep the records and all that stuff. So, I'm a pretty methodical person. I guess we can figure this out. Do you have any place I can sit? So we got some old milk crates, and and they decided to have it in the headquarters of District 17, Subdistrict 3, which is that big building out there on the highway downtown. And I don't know what it is now, but so I got a board together, and with help from Emil and whoever else. And one of the key people was a teacher named Jim Haygood, who was just a really smart person, and he seemed to know everybody, and he'd been part of Linda Ann's class about labor history. And so we started compiling names of really old people who were in the UMW. So that was a UMWA oral history project that was, and so so I just started in, I got a tape recorder, and I've never interviewed anybody in my life. But it seemed like it was going to be really exciting, because this was 1983, and we found people who were 80 and 85 years old. So they had been here at Blair Mountain. And I talked to a lot of other people who tried to do oral history in Logan. One of them was Bob Spence, who was part of the newspaper family down there. And everybody said, don't do this. And I said, why not? It sounds great. And I said, I don't think you should do this. So I didn't pay any attention to him. I just went on with it, and got the list, and I went and introduced myself to people. So it was really easy to get people to talk to me, because some of them were presidents of union locals, and they were all old, and they all had plenty to say. So it was very, very interesting. And I just want to read this one little paragraph. Do we have time for this?
Yes, please do.
This is an interview with one of the first people that I talked to. His name was Deacon A.J. Jones, and he lived at Kistler on Buffalo Creek. And he was a wonderful person, and he was a very strong union man. And he had come to Logan County just before the mine wars started. But he'd been a member of the union in Boone County. So he came over here, came over to Logan County as a union man. And he was absolutely part of this. There was a whole undercover group of people who were pro-union, and they were coming in, and they were going to be ready whenever the time came. So, let's see. Now, the Standard Island Creek Coal Company was at Taplin, West Virginia. They had a great big theater building there, one company store, and they had, I don't know how many employees. It was awfully big mining industry there. But anyhow, the men that was willing to go to Blair Mountain of their own will and accord, without any persuasion, they would give them a rifle and ammunition and things, and pay them wages just like they were working in the mines, to go to Blair Mountain to help defend the oncoming surge of union activity from Coal River to cross over. So the battle was between the miners of fighting each other, but now the coal company was doing it. They were the powers behind it. You can see the picture now, can't you? And I said, yeah, I can see the picture. So what about people that wanted the union to come? What did they do? What did you do? Well, I'm coming to that now. If I wasn't sympathetic just like I'd been identified with the union, I had taken an obligation, when I went into the union, that I would never rise up against a union brother. And all I had to do was tell them that, no, I'd rather not go. Now, they wouldn't force me to go, but they wouldn't trust me. Now, there was many days that they let us. They locked us in the pool room down under that theater. They let us shoot pool all day. They fed us. I wasn't married or anything, so I didn't have anybody to cook for me. They fed us and everything, and we didn't have anything to do, but they wouldn't let us out of there. And I said, oh, that's just like being in jail. He says, yep, it's just the same. And like I told you, these deputy sheriffs and things, they was right around there. How many people were down there with you? Well, there were about from 25 to 30, I would say, that was down in there. But look, there were 400 or 500 employees on the job, and that 20 or 30, they'd call us scabs or rats or something like that, scared to defend yourself. But there was a deepened motive than that, and they didn't understand it. We had taken an obligation sometime before that we wouldn't rise up against the union like that. So there were as many as 25 or 30 union men down there already. Yes, down in there. Were you all at the same mine? Yep, it was all at the same mine, Standard Island Creek Coal Company. So that's how it looked on the other side of Blair Mountain. And there were a lot of other stories. He said he swears that somebody told him they saw people get burned up in the power plant. So we should excavate the power plant and see if there's any bones.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that with us.
There are so many great stories. I'm not kidding you. I was it was so inspiring to hear people talk about what they'd suffered, because they told about how hard it was, especially the ones who were brought in. And a lot of people were brought in. I said, were you brought in to break strikes? And they said, no, it was a scab mine to start with. There was no union over here. Everybody had to sign the yellow dog to live there, the oath to not join a union before you could live in a house or work. And of course, the company owned the house, so they can throw you out in a minute. I'm saying this in case anybody's not from West Virginia.
Yeah. Did you find any resistance to this project?
No, I didn't until the end. There were part of the excitement that we were having was that so many people, I didn't realize this, but I was interviewing a lot of African Americans. A.J. Jones was African American. Joe Harvey, who was the president of the local up at Lobato on Buffalo Creek, was African American. Because they lived a long time, apparently. There were some white miners that were old, but not as many. And so I think, I'm not sure what the reasons were, but at some point after about, I guess we've been doing it a year or something, I got some pushback from some of the higher ups in the union. And they said, well, you're a communist, so you better get out of here. I grew up in Nashville. And so there's this refrain in the South that anybody who wants to be on an equal footing with Black people is a communist. And that's the way that white supremacy is used to keep white people from joining together with everybody else. It's the oldest trick in the book, but it was a serious charge. So I had to get out and give it up. And it was heartbreaking. But I took a lot of the interviews, and I think they're at the college, at the Southwest Virginia Community College there. And then I have some that are here because we got them. I did a lot of the transcripts. There was a woman, I think her name was Linda Bailey, who came to work also on the project. and she helped with the transcripts too. So it takes about 40 hours to transcribe a 2-hour interview. And that was, I think, with a manual typewriter, so it probably wouldn't take that long today. But and then we got the vocational school to do some of the transcripts. So that may have been the other thing. You know, there may have been somebody at the vocational school who saw these transcripts and didn't like where it was coming from. Anyway, so yeah, that was heartbreaking, but it isn't over yet.
It's not over yet. The flame is still very much alive in
Right.
West Virginia. And in Clothier, which is in Logan County, we just put up the first monuments to the Blair Mountain March. So
that's wonderful.
The museum is on the move.
You guys are like a dream come true. It is, you know, when I heard that you were going to do this, when you and I first met a couple of years ago, I just couldn't believe my ears. I thought, hallelujah.
Yeah. So for folks watching, Janet and I met by fate at Southern Appalachian Labor School. The museum was having one of our first community meetings for the Battle of Blair Mountain Centennial. I think this was like 2019. So it was a couple of years before the event. And, you know, Janet was like, what are y'all doing? I was like, oh, we're going to plan a centennial for the Battle of Blair Mountain across all these counties. And it was just like, and we exchanged emails and we kept in touch. And it means so much to bring you on tonight and hear stories. And
this is so terrific. I mean, as a West Virginian in exile, you know, it's been hard to do any of the work that I used to do when I lived here. And so it's really great to see that it's still going on. And so many people are on board too. And we have these little tiny projects. The West Virginia Women's Commission, bless their hearts, you know, they started doing women's history. And I was the one who was you could write about the coal fields, you know. So I interviewed Aunt Jenny Wilson in Logan County. And then when they did the special edition of West Virginia history, that's when I came back to Logan County, even though after I'd gone to New York, and interviewed the wives of a lot of the miners that I'd interviewed in the first place for the Logan County Coal Miners Project. So we got those stories in there.
Yeah, good. I want to end with one last question, which is a loaded question, but why is it important for working people to know their own history?
I bet you can answer that. Well, there's so much individualism in our country and in our culture. And so if you're having a hard time, if you can't make your bills, then you're blaming yourself, you know, or you're running up a credit card debt. You know, with the company store, we have credit cards now. It's way worse than my mother would never buy anything at the company store. She was always in trouble. But this thing about working people not seeing themselves as part of a group. We only see these problems as individual problems. It's like what I was talking about earlier about the miners wanting to go it alone to solve the problem of healthcare. It's a problem we all have. And so it's really important for us to learn our history. And one of the really great things about history, and even some of the, not just the scholarship, some things that are written for popular audiences, which is why public history is so important, is they talk about the efforts that people made to get together. And that's what Blair Mountain is a perfect example of, that kind of story. Because even if you don't win, you got together and tried to get together even more. There's a really cool book that we always use at the Freedom School called Labor's Untold Story, which is about a lot of different union organizing and organizing during Reconstruction after slavery was ended, to try to, when people tried to get together to make a better world. And the importance of that, the way that story is told, is it shows the strategies that were used to keep people up. And it's really important to understand those strategies, the strategy of race and nationality, the things that said, you have nothing in common with these other people, you just have to look out for yourself. And that's not going to get us where we need to go.
Well, thank you, Jana. I have taken way more of your time than what I initially told you, but I really appreciate you coming onto the forum and sharing your life's work with us. And thank you for doing it. You know, I think the museum would not be around if it weren't for people like you. And so sincerely, thank you.
Warms my heart. Thank you so much for all the work you're doing. Everybody who's watching, join the Mine Workers Museum, send them some money. It can't do this without bucks. It's really important.
That's so true. I want to say thanks to the West Virginia Humanities Council for supporting us in this programming. I want to say thanks to my colleague, Kirsten Uten. You cannot see her, but she is behind the scenes, has been promoting the heck out of this event and helping us with tech. And of course, thanks to the museum members and donors, as Janet said, it would not be possible to do this work without you. If you'd like to join us in our mission and become a steward of this history, we'll drop a link in the comments now for you to sign up. Your membership dues, to put it plainly, just provide unrestricted funds to the museum and support our day-to-day work, including the programming that you're listening to now. So if it's in your heart, we invite you to choose a membership rate that feels appropriate for your budget, even if it does not correlate with the suggestions that we have provided. And as a reminder, we want to hear from y'all, the folks who are watching this right now. We've dropped a 3-minute survey in the chat so you can let us know how we did and who you want to hear from next. We really, really care what you have to say, so please take a few moments to give us feedback and plan for our future programming. We hope to see y'all next Tuesday as I welcome Dr. Ann Lawrence to the forum to talk more about her experience collecting oral history interviews in the 1970s and where her work has taken her today. I want to say thanks again, Janet, and good night, everyone.